Hello, hello, hello. It's Will. Welcome to episode 5 of From Bronze the GM and miniKanren. Today is Wednesday, February 12th, 2025. I know I promised in the last episode that we were going to look at numbers and things like addition and scheme in Java. I'm feeling a little tired today. I think I'm going to keep it a little short, probably do the other video tomorrow night, hopefully, where we talk about the scheme in Java. Today I want to talk about more briefly than yesterday, which was 2.5 hours, some other thoughts I've had that aren't technical, but I think it's really important to talk about these in the beginning, okay? But before we get into that, let's just do a review of episode 4. When I put up that video, originally I recorded using this 8-bit workshop IDE, web-based IDE for retro computing, which is very cool. But I was playing showing some screens from like Atari 2600 or whatever, and they were just like flashing. The screen was just like flashing lights. I was like, that's not real friendly to upload. So I cut out a few seconds of flashing lights. So if you notice there's like a little gap, that's what it was. And cut out a few seconds of me talking, but that's, I don't think really matters. If you are interested in joining the Discord, just email me, okay? And I'll send you a link. Yeah, and so last time we talked about some things that are important, like precision of language, knowing the difference between an expression and a statement. We talked about chobo versus gosu. We want, chobo. Well, we might be chobo at certain things, but we want to get to gosu, and we want to use, gosu strategies and techniques. Okay. Even if we start by executing them at a chobo level, we want to be doing the things that will allow us to progress, and we don't want to be doing the things that will keep us forever bronze. All right. And we don't want to rage quit. Research can be a very rage-inducing thing. We don't want to rage quit. We want to keep going, sort of to keep calm and carry on. And we remember White Raw, more GG, more skill, okay? If you're doing research, there'll be lots of setbacks. That's just the nature of it. If you're submitting papers or submitting talk proposals or whatever, there'll be times those are rejected. If you have grant proposals, those will be rejected. There'll be times you give talks and they're not well received, or maybe you mess up the talk somehow, whatever. Okay, more GG, more skill. I've given a lot of bad talks, but I've tried to learn from those talks, and over time, my talks have improved a lot. I still mess things up somehow, but sometimes. But even when I mess up, it's usually not like the heroic levels of messing up I did in the beginning. Sometimes I really bomb, like a comedian would talk about, but I rarely at that level at this point. More likely, I don't think I'm bringing my A game, or I didn't communicate it as clearly as I could have, or maybe I took too long. But anyway, more GG, more skill, right? There's like this, saying in Go, lose your first 100 games as quickly as possible, or is something like, get past your first 100 losses, or, whatever. And that's kind of like, okay, if you're going to give talks, if you're going to give lots of talks, give your first 100 bad talks as quickly as possible is one way to look at it. It's like, yeah, you want to improve. Okay. Just don't throw stuff out there. But the point is, communication is a skill that requires lots of practice, just like writing code. You wouldn't say, oh, you want to be a professional programmer and do research level programming language investigation. It's okay to write, 3 programs a year. It's like, no, of course not. In the same way, if you want to be, skilled at communicating ideas, you shouldn't be doing three things a year. Make a YouTube channel or something, whatever. Nowadays with the internet, there are lots of ways to communicate and express ideas. Talk to people about what you're working on. Try to get better at explaining things. Just do it on a continual basis. I once calculated I'd given something like 3,000, there were 3,000 public speeches or public speaking, because I used to be a public school teacher. I used to run a summer camp. I was, just like countless times up in front of a group, talking, public speaking. So I've done that thousands of times. And now I've, taught a lot in the classroom, including with programming languages, and given lots of talks. And, every time, even though I had been a public school teacher and given lots of talks, when I first started giving talks about programming languages and academic talks, it was a real learning curve, and I've gotten better over time. So more GG, more skill. And I've given some really rotten academic talks, but I think I've given some decent talks, and I think the trend is upward. So just keep doing it. Okay. Just keep doing it. Try to learn. So those are the things that were important. And also we had this laddering practice. Okay. So your laddering practice from last time was learning at least one language. Well, that's what we're going to keep doing. Learning at least, all right. No. Sorry. This is the reviewing of the ladder practice. Okay. So what was our ladder practice this time? Here we go. Here is a ladder practice. Start a research notebook. Okay. Make time to think and write in the notebook, and read at least 3 abstracts for papers each from 3 different years of the scheme and functional programming workshop, preferably from different years or even different decades. And then pick one of those papers and read it, or at least skim it. Read it to the extent you can. Okay, so that's what we were talking about last time. And we also talked about a whole bunch of other things. And we were starting to get into, some programming language comparison things that we want to talk about, Scheme and Java, but I'm going to hold off on that for another episode. And I just want to talk a little bit about sort of my objectives for making this series and my perspective, okay, and why I'm talking so much about things that are not technical details. Okay, so you might think, well, we're just going to talk about Scheme, or we're just going to talk about miniKanren, or we'll talk about continuations, or, backtracking search, or whatever it is, okay? Why, but Will, why aren't you just talking about Scheme and miniKanren programming? Why are we talking about other things so much, like 2.5 hours yesterday? So the reason is, if you are watching this series and and you're someone who's taking the series, sort of seriously at the level of, hopefully there's some entertainment value, but you want to try to learn from it. What that means is, we're trying to get to GM. Okay. So you want to get to GM or move towards that, whatever that means for you. So that could mean you're a student and you want to go to, graduate school and get a PhD, or maybe you already have a PhD and you want to go into academic programming languages. Okay. Or maybe you're a hobbyist, and you want to understand what academic researchers in programming languages do and what they think about. Or maybe you work in industry, whatever it is. Okay. And so your objective, you could have totally different objectives, all the people watching us. But the basic idea is that we're going to move towards what, researchers who are trying to push the cutting edge of programming languages think about. Okay, so that's where we're trying to go. Now, if you look at what, say, academics in programming languages do, say at a university, I can assure you they don't spend all their time programming. Okay. It's not like they're spending 8 or 12 hours a day, like hacking Scheme. There might be a few people who do that, but in general, they're not doing that. They're doing other things. They're teaching, mentoring, writing papers, reading papers, maybe writing grant proposals, maybe reviewing grant proposals, okay, serving on program committees, traveling to conferences, maybe sponsoring visiting researchers, maybe going on sabbatical, giving talks, okay, writing letters of recommendation, introducing, speakers at a conference, or serving as a chair for a session at a conference, organizing a conference, whatever it is, sending out emails, advertising a conference, being maybe the publicity chair, or sending out emails to people who might serve on a committee, asking them to serve on a committee, all sorts of things. Okay. There are lots and lots of things that someone, say, in academia does. A lot of it has to do with communication. A lot of it has to do with keeping track of what is going on in the community, like what work is coming out that seems interesting, what are the trends, what are the new possibilities, what seems exciting, in addition to their own research. And a lot of it has to do with communicating with colleagues, or maybe students, or whatever it is. Maybe writing a report for National Science Foundation. All of those sorts of things. Okay, so it would be, if I really want to give you a fair picture of what it means to do this at, sort of the pro level, I can't just say, okay, well, we're just going to learn some Scheme, we're going to learn some miniKanren from the purely technical part, because that's a critical and a very important part, and we're definitely going to go into those details. But you have to understand that that's not what most academic, people studying PL spend their time, the majority of their time doing. They're not spending all their time just like hacking. And this turns out to be a surprise, and a rude surprise to some people saying going to get a PhD, where they really enjoy the programming part. They enjoy the hacking. They're happy to spend, all their days, hacking, and maybe learning about new techniques and stuff like that, hanging out with other hackers. And then they get bummed out when they realize, like, oh yeah, you have to write up these papers, or you have to write your dissertation, which is effectively a book. It's a lot of times dissertations just get turned into books without really any changes. Okay, so you're basically writing a book, and a lot of people are like, well, I like programming. I've never really written anything of any length, and so now they're expected to write a book. Okay, and then if they want to continue in academia as a researcher, guess what? They're also expected to know how to write grant proposals, and they'll be serving on program committees. So they need to read papers and then write up reviews of those papers. And then they need to be giving talks and all sorts of things. They need to be assessing the work coming out. They listen to a lot of talks and try to think about that. And they have to mentor students and maybe hire people. They get grants, and then they have to maybe deal with payroll and, checking spreadsheets to figure out, are they going to run out of money for this grant proposal? So this is sort of the mini game thing where, being an academic, you have all these mini games like, okay, hire someone. Okay, now mentor a student, and the student's having problems. And so you're not trained to do most of those things. You have to figure it out. Like maybe you have a modicum of training, but basically you have to figure out most of these things on your own. You're trained in the technical aspects. Okay. You're not trained to manage, a budget or deal with payroll or, hiring or things like that. Now you may have some help. Okay. So there may be people at your organization to help with some of those things, but often, ultimately is coming down to you, and you're ultimately responsible for these things. And there are a whole bunch of things that you have to do as an academic that are not, programming related. Okay. Even if you're not in academia, if you're doing research, a lot of it's communication, a lot of it's learning the literature, a lot of it is weighing ideas, looking for trends, looking for similarities, trying to deeply understand ideas, communicating with other people, figuring out which venue is appropriate if you're trying to communicate your research, if you want to do it at, in some academic venue. Okay, so there is an academic bent to what we're talking about here. Okay, this isn't, this is not just learning scheme, or not just learning miniKanren. This is like, okay, the end goal is to be able to do things like do original research, pick a research problem that seems promising, learn the literature, do the research, maybe get stuck a bunch of times, get unstuck, and then communicate the research, through both writing, like an academic paper, let's say, and give an academic talk. Also things like, well, how do you deal with if you submit, how do you pick a venue? How do you respond to reviews? And some venues, they have what's called a rebuttal period. So it's a 2-phase review where you get back reviews from people who read your paper, and then you have a chance to do a rebuttal. You usually can't just like change the paper, but you can answer their questions. Sometimes there's something like shepherding, okay, where maybe there's something in the paper that's interesting, but the paper's not written in the style expected for that venue. And so sometimes you'll get an offer for someone on the program committee to shepherd your paper, which means that they're going to help you walk through, like how to improve the paper. Or maybe your paper is accepted with a bunch of revisions, okay? Or, and if you're submitting to a journal, this process might happen many times, that kind of thing. And then it's like, well, say your paper is accepted and say you're going to give a talk, or maybe you submit a lightning talk for a workshop, okay? Are you going to do it in person? Are you going to do it online? If you do it in person, or are you going to travel this conference? Is it local, or do you have to travel internationally? And if you're at the conference, how do you approach people? Or, are you just going to like stay in your hotel room except when you go to give a talk? Or are you going to spend all your time, in talks? Or are you going to try to meet up with people? Like, how are you going to spend your time? How are you going to try to communicate with people? How do you find people in the community? How do you find mentors? How do you find people who are willing to, help teach you about not just like the technical things, but about how to do research, how to communicate research, all those sorts of things. So that's the stuff that's really not in the books. Okay. That's the thing. There are some books that can help. There's some talks or some resources. But that's the part that I see missing. And so that's one reason I want to make this series, is that if you're in a PhD program or doing research in undergrad at a university that is an R1, which means very intense research activity university, and you have access to mentors, you have access to professors and postdocs and, really good PhD students, they will mentor you in these things, or they should. They will give you, hints and pointers and point you to resources and opportunities and help you navigate things like venues. And, how do you think about, like, if you're applying to a PhD program, what do you do? How do you do that? If you're applying to a PhD program, how do you afford it? How long is a PhD program? Should you apply for a PhD program in the United States or Canada or Europe or Asia or wherever? Where should you go? What are the trade-offs? And how do you pick a PhD program? How do you pick an advisor? What happens if the advisor relationship doesn't work out? Like all of these things. What happens if your advisor, switches universities while you're in grad school? Should you get a master's degree or should you get a PhD? What are the, trade-offs of getting a PhD? Are there any disadvantages other than the amount of time it takes? Are there advantages? What sort of jobs can you get? There's a whole bunch of things that you can get when you're in that environment and you're surrounded by other people who are doing that and you have mentors. And this differs even between different academic disciplines. So, for the last 7 years, I've been, switching more into biology and medicine, those sorts of things, biomedicine. Biomedicine works very, very differently, especially like the medicine part works very differently than academic programming languages, very, very differently. Biology also works differently, right? So each academic area has its own traditions and, unspoken rules and its own venues. And, some places in some areas, maybe it's all based on books, and some it's based on journals, and some it's based on conferences like cryptography, mathematical cryptography. Crypto in Santa Barbara is a big deal. So part of going up towards GM, where you have at least an understanding of kind of what's going on, whether or not you're really going to try to make a shot at doing original research in it. Part of us is understanding that there's a whole lot more than just the programming part or the technical part. Okay, the technical part's actually the minority of the things you have to do. It's a critical part, but there's a whole lot more. Okay. So, all right, let's make a gaming analogy. I was just watching Vibe, pro gamer, or at least former programmer who does a lot of streaming on Twitch and has a YouTube channel. And Vibe used to be a pro StarCraft 2 player. And he was talking about why he stopped playing StarCraft 2. He's playing some just for fun, but he doesn't play it in a serious way. And in fact, people kept asking him, why don't you play StarCraft 2 anymore? That's how he got famous for streaming. And he also asked, because he made a couple of Bronze to Grandmasters series, including a very, very good one that I watched that helped me a tremendous amount in terms of my gaming. Are you going to make another Bronze to GM or B2 GM as he calls it? And he said, definitely not. Okay, definitely not going to do that. And he, I just watched a video, like a 45-minute video where he talked about like that whole history. But one of the things he said I thought was really interesting. He said he was really good at Warcraft 3 when StarCraft 2 came out. And he decided he was, when the StarCraft 2 beta came out, he decided he was going to try to go pro at some point. But he said he didn't know anyone who was a pro gamer or who was in that community or in that circle. He was a very good gamer. He knew other people who were very good gamers. But he didn't know how to turn pro, which I thought was a very interesting thing. So he was extremely good at StarCraft 2. Like there were times where he was like number one on the ladder and, a very strong tournament player, all that stuff. But he didn't know how to turn pro in the beginning. And I think this is very similar, right? So maybe you're just an awesome programmer, or maybe you learn programming really quickly, or you're super into it, like he was in the StarCraft 2. And then, you can pick up things like Scheme and miniKanren and play with those and, really, really go into it. And maybe use those things very creatively and come up with ideas of how different approaches could be used and so forth. So that's like being really good at StarCraft 2 at playing it, but then that's different than turning pro. Like, turning pro means if you're going to do this for a living, then maybe you have to join a team and negotiate a contract and figure out, do you have the budget to travel to an international tournament, or weigh the pros and cons, that type of thing. Do you stream? How much time do you practice? How do you practice? Do you live in a team house or try to move to South Korea? Do you move to Seoul if you're a professional gamer and try to live in a team house? If so, how are you going to do that? Do you know anyone, in a team house? Like how are you going to figure that out? Do you speak Korean? Right? So there are a whole bunch of things that are different than being good at StarCraft 2 involved in turning pro. Are you going to try to get sponsors? Okay. If you get sponsors, once again, you have contracts to negotiate. Are there sponsors that you're not willing to take on? All those sorts of things. So, are you willing to move across the country? Are you willing to live in a house with a bunch of people you don't know and maybe don't get along with in order to make this happen? Are you willing to eat, cup noodles for years and tighten your belt to make a run at it? So that's the difference between being good at StarCraft and turning pro. It's a different thing. Are you willing to grind ladder games for 12 hours a day or practice for 12 hours a day, or are you going to get burned out like really quickly? Okay. So I'm not saying that your goal is to turn pro in the point, like in the sense of making a living. Okay. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, if you want to kind of understand what's involved in turning pro, or at least what's involved in presenting research in an academic venue and things like choosing research problem, maybe doing literature searches, picking venues, trying to understand, like what venue would make sense, and, how do you write the paper? How do you do the citations? How do you, how do you do this and that and other things? And if you do go to a conference, like, well, how do you take advantage of that? All those things are not normally talked about, or you're not going to find those in a book. You are going to have to be part of the community. Like, okay, so this is actually a big reason why you go to grad school or something like that, is you're immersed in that environment. And it's sort of like, if you go to a school, like when I was at Indiana, there were a huge number of people studying functional programming there, right? A whole bunch of grad students and postdocs and professors, and undergraduates who were interested, and even high school students. And so Lindley Hall was almost like a team house, right? You were just like surrounded by people. And I couldn't walk down the hall at some point, once everyone knew me and I knew everyone, I couldn't walk down the hall at Lindley Hall without someone grabbing me and showing me something they were doing for their research. It was really cool and really intense. And, we'd go out and, on Friday nights after the PL seminar and, go out to 4th Street and have a nice dinner, and then go out and hang out for the evening, and we'd talk programming languages and Scheme and stuff like that. So that was like being in a team house, that type of environment. And if you don't go to grad school, or if you're not in that sort of environment, if you're kind of on your own, or maybe you are in school, but you're not in the school that has people who are in, part of this community, how do you go about doing this? So that's a big motivation for me to make these sorts of this series, is to try to share a lot of these things that I've learned. Now, like I used to be a hobbyist. I was a hobbyist for a long time before I went back to school, and got my computer science undergrad degree. And then I worked in industry for a while, and then I got my PhD. And so, when I first learned about Scheme, I was like super excited about it. When I learned about Eiffel, I was super excited about it, but I was very much like outsider. Okay. And that was the thing. And so, like, I remember the first Scheme workshop I went to, I was like, oh, this is the coolest thing ever, right? I really, really want to be part of this community. And now I'm on the steering committee. It's like, okay, what happened, in this 20 years between me going there and, it's like a fanboy, and being on the steering committee and having run it a number of times. So, what did I learn? What were the things that were a difference between me, kind of just being an enthusiastic outsider and me being on the steering committee. Now, a lot of it's like just hanging around, actually, just me. That was a big part of it. It's like, okay, one of the things I learned is if you really want to be part of a community, as long as you're nice to people and respectful, if you just like hang around, if you just hang around for a long time, that goes a long way. So now I've been hanging around for like 20 years at these conferences, and I guess, somehow it's like now I've become the old timer. Yeah. So here are a couple maybe things to think about. So a book I like a lot, this book series I like, is this Theoretical Minimum series. Okay. So Leonard Susskind, he was a physicist at Stanford, and George Zabrowski wrote the first book in this series, and it was based on Leonard Susskind's continuing education or adult education class that he would teach, I guess, in the evenings for people who are, maybe they got a law degree or whatever, or became a doctor or, researcher in some other area, but they were really interested in physics, and now they want to go back and, learn how like a physicist thinks. Something, not just like a pop sci book, but where they're learning differential equations and all that, but, no intention of they're going to be professional. Okay. So these books are really cool, and they very much focus on, like how a physicist would think about these topics. Now, I am not a practicing physicist, so I'm not sure, how close they're getting to how, someone at the cutting edge would approach these topics. But certainly I learned a whole lot just from, say, the first book. Very, very different from how I learned physics. So I find that really interesting. Now, there's something that you're not going to find in this series of books. And, like I said, he's not, aiming this at people who want to become professional physicists. But he's not talking about the things that are sort of outside the technical realm for someone who wants to be a physicist. Okay. So someone who wanted to be an academic researcher in physics or something like that. There are some books or some things that talk about stuff that's not technical. So here's a pretty famous book, A PhD is Not Enough, right? So, so this is based on 40 years of experience by the author. And, oh, no. This is the blurb. Okay. The blurb got me. It took me over 40 years to learn from experience what can be learned in 1 hour from this guide. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Blurbs are going to blurb. But I've read this book, and it's, pretty thin. But the whole point is, like, a PhD is not enough. Okay. If you want to be a working, researcher in academia, let's say, PhD is fine, but, there's a whole lot more to do. It's not like once you finish your dissertation, now you're all done, right? So that talks a little bit about some of these issues. And there are some other books like this. Now, one thing I've noticed over the years, and one motivation for me to talk about these things, is that I've served as a reviewer on a number of program committees where enthusiastic outsiders, people outside that academic, group or tradition, or, people who are not coming from like a PhD in programming languages, or coming from, say, Scheme community or miniKanren community or functional programming community or whatever, where someone is very enthusiastic and they come up with something they think is really important and they want other people to know, and they write a paper and they submit it, or maybe they write a talk proposal and they submit it to an academic venue. And then they're almost universally very disheartened by the reaction they get from the reviews. And the reason is, like the way I think about some of these submissions I've seen is like they're almost like, visionary art or outsider art. Like here you have someone who's very creative and full of energy and excitement. They're outside the norms of that community they're submitting to. And that can be good in some ways because maybe they're coming with a totally different perspective. On the other hand, there's a set of, practices that the academic communities have developed. So, for example, if you're saying that you've got this great new idea, well, you need to be able to explain the idea. And that comes back to things like precision of language and knowing the vocabulary that's used in that field or within that community or within, for that programming language or whatever it is. So that's part of it. Another is if you're claiming that this is new, well, can you answer questions like, what's the work that's closest to what you're doing? Often what would happen is I would look at one of these papers and the idea being proposed would sound to me pretty much identical to some idea that was known a long time ago, maybe had been known in the community for 40 years. And I'd compare my notes with other reviewers after I'd written up my review, and we'd all be like, yeah, did this person just rediscover this thing that's been known for 40 years? Now, that's not a bad thing to rediscover something that was come up with 40 years ago. Maybe that's a step towards a deep understanding of something that extends what was done 40 years ago, or maybe, leads to a deep understanding of problems with that approach or trade-offs that could lead to other research that's useful. Richard Feynman would talk about that. If he was going into a field, he would always start with the original paper, and he would try to work everything else out on his own. And then, or maybe he wouldn't even start with the first paper. He would try to just solve the problem immediately. Like, how would I go about doing it? Because when he was working from that state of ignorance, that meant he was at a maximum creativity. And then he could read up on what other people did. And he would try to do work and come up with things. And then he would find, the thing that he came up with, this idea he came up with that he kind of worked out, was first discovered in 1752. And then, you try again for another problem. Okay, this one was, this was discovered in 1820. And then keep doing it. And then eventually he would come up with something that, no one had seen before. Okay. But if you're in, some research field, especially in something like programming languages where there's been a lot of activity, and sort of it's very hard to come up with an idea that's not related to something that people have studied. People are going to expect that you be able to explain the idea, not just clearly, but explain the idea in relation to other work that exists, and do that in a way that fits the norms of the community. Okay, so you should have references. You should be making claims that are precise. You should, what's new about this contribution? What's important about it? Do you have examples? Are the examples understandable? Does someone have to go off and read your 17 missives and manifestos before they can understand, your document? Are you making claims left and right that are unsupported and that are not, relevant to your main argument? What is your main argument? Do you have a main argument? All those sorts of things. Sometimes there's like a core interesting idea, and the paper with shepherding and things like that, can be, sort of rescued. And then other times it's not going to fly. And so, here's someone who's really passionate about this and wants to share the idea with the academic community, and they're getting swatted down. I don't want that to happen to you if you want to do something like write a paper, or if other people who want to do that. So there are resources So first of all, there are things that you need to know, like, okay, there's the Association for Computing Machinery Special Interest Group on Programming Languages, SIGPLAN, ACM SIGPLAN. They run a bunch of conferences. And so here are things like POPL and PLDI and OOPSLA and ICFP, okay? There are a whole bunch of other conferences they run as well. And things like the Dynamic Languages Symposium, okay? So if you're into things like Scheme, you could submit to the Dynamic Languages Symposium. Here's one on generative programming, all that. So you should know that these venues exist. If you're doing work that you think you might want to share academically or get published or whatever, part of the thing is knowing what the venues are and knowing where to find the proceedings and knowing how to go through the abstracts and all that and try to find, or doing various types of online searches and trying to find work that is similar to what you're doing and knowing how to cite similar work, knowing where to submit, knowing what the deadlines are, okay, being able to read the call for papers or the call for presentations or whatever and understand that, knowing, how to use the, LaTeX templates and the bibliography, like the BibTeX style or whatever it is. If you're working with someone else, maybe use Overleaf online and share, or maybe you have, a Git repo and you use TechLive install on your machines, whatever. There's just like mechanics like that, So here's POPL that was held in Denver in January this year, and so how do you go to POPL? How do you register for POPL? How do you, if you go to POPL, how do you decide which talks to go to? Because there are lots of things here. How do you decide which workshops to go to, what the tracks are? Are you, if you're a student, there are things like the Programming Languages Mentoring Workshop, okay? So this PLMW, and this is held in different venues. So this is PLMW at POPL, okay? So, are you going to attend POPL? Are you eligible to attend POPL? I'm sorry, the PLMW, okay? What's the focus of that? What do you get out of it? So all sorts of things like that. And then, you want to write a research paper. Okay, so how do you learn how to do that? Well, you read a lot of research papers, you find papers you like, and you think about what's the core of your paper. And there are resources like How to Write a Great Research Paper by Simon Payne-Jones. Simon Payne-Jones also has How to Give a Great Research Talk. Okay, so these aren't the only resources. There are lots of resources like this, but, trying to find, like you don't want to wait until the night before the deadline for the conference before you're like, okay, let me go read this, let me go watch this YouTube video on how to write a great research paper. Okay, you want to start beforehand. You don't want to write your draft at the last minute. I mean, I've learned that the hard way. There are also books like How to Write a Lot. Okay, so even if you do know how to write well and how to write an academic paper and in your community and all that, you still have to make the time to do so. And how do you do that when you have everything else going? If you're not a professional, if you're a professional, one of the things you're paid to do is to write and to communicate your ideas. So you should take that seriously. And if you're not being paid to do that, then you probably have all sorts of other things going on. So how do you protect your time or make time, or how do you figure out how to write? And people who've followed me for a long time know that I've often struggled with that. Here's another book, Professors as Writers. Okay, so here's another book on academic. You don't have to be a professor to benefit from these books, but it's talking about what do you do as an academic? And there are things like there's a zillion books on writing, which maybe I'll recommend at some point, just on general writing. Yeah, so SIGPLAN has these mentoring initiatives like the Programming Languages Mentoring Workshop, which I mentioned, and then there's also this long-term mentoring program where SIGPLAN matches experienced people in like academic programming languages or whatever with mentees, and I've been part of that program and mentored people and done research with people I was mentoring and all that. So that's now, this may or may not be appropriate for you, depending on, where you are, whether or not you want to go pro or whatever it is. But you should know that exists. Okay. So that's a resource that exists. There are also things like the Oregon Programming Languages Summer School, okay, which is held every year, usually in Oregon. This past year is held in Boston. And one great thing about this is the videos are online. You can find videos online for this, but I went to this years ago, actually after I finished my PhD, and I got to meet a whole bunch of people who I still know, so it was like, these are people who are, at least some of whom will be going into PL and doing research in it long term. So that's an interesting thing. And even if you don't go to the summer school, you can find the videos online and so forth. So there are lots of resources. And then there's also, meeting people and communicating and all that. So these are important things to know. And if you're in a PhD program for programming languages, let's say, like you'll know all this stuff, or you'll be around people who know all this stuff and they'll teach it to you. Okay. But if you're not in a situation where you're surrounded by people who do it, is sort of like you're good at StarCraft, you want to turn pro, but you don't know how to do it. Okay, so I'm assuming if you watch this, you're either a good programmer or someone capable of becoming a good programmer, and you could do, programming and technical work at the research level. Like, I don't have any doubt of that. But just be aware there's a whole lot more to it. Just like being a pro gamer, there's more to it than being good at a video game, or same for chess or Go or whatever. There's a lot more complicated, like especially if you want to do it for a living. Okay. Being paid to do that sort of work is quite tricky, actually. And in academia, if you want to do academia, there turns out there are lots of jobs in academia, lots of trade-offs. So it's complicated. Okay. It's complicated. So that's why I think it's important to talk about these things. So, let's see, was that all? Those are those. Let's see, yeah. But anyway, like an analogy I would make is like with the climbing I told you about last time. So there's like the face climbing, there's like the indoor, bouldering and indoor wall climbing. And even there's different types. So there's like bouldering where you don't have a rope and you're, close to the ground, and there's like thick mats underneath you. And then there's sort of just like the face climbing where you have these plastic holds, and this top roping face climbing where there's a rope that goes through a pulley, and someone's belaying you or holding the other end of the rope with a device, and you just like climb up. And then there's lead climbing indoors where you're climbing up the face of the wall, and you have to pull up the rope behind you and clip in to these carabiners. Okay, so that's more complicated and also more dangerous. But then there's a totally different type of climbing, which is the crack climbing, which isn't not at all like the face climbing where you have those like plastic holds, and not at all like the outdoor sport climbing, let's say, where there's lots of like things to hold on to because the rock has little things protruding from it. Like if you're crack climbing, if you're climbing a splitter crack, you're like putting your fingers in the crack, or your elbow, or your knee or whatever. And it's a different set of techniques. And if you don't, you could be really, really good at face climbing, and then you go to some route where part of it's crack. It is like you can't even make the first move. Okay, so there are lots of things like that in say academic programming language research, where like you could be really good at face climbing, which would be like really good at the technical parts of Scheme and miniKanren. Be good from a programmer standpoint, but can you communicate the ideas clearly? Can you find can you discover whether or not what you're working on has been done before? Can you write a paper that communicates the ideas clearly without, saying this is the greatest thing ever made, but at the same time explaining why it's maybe of interest or important. Can you avoid making, sort of outrageous claims all over the place that are not supported in the paper, or claims that may or may not be true but are irrelevant? There are a whole bunch of things that you have to do. It's like sort of the mini game type thing. So that's important, and that's what I see inside and out. Because, I work with researchers at a bunch of universities and fancy research centers and national labs and all that. And, I see the environment that the people who are working or studying in those environments have, and what they talk about and think about and share with each other, and all the opportunities and the mentoring. And I actually think if you are not in that environment, the hardest part is not learning the technical stuff. It's learning all the rest. Okay. It's the going from outsider artist to understanding the norms of the community for things like writing a paper or presenting a paper, or reviewing a paper. That is a different thing. And if you don't go to grad school for it, you're probably not just going to learn on your own. You could learn it through osmosis, through like reading a zillion papers and stuff like that. But I want to be more explicit about it and try to explicitly, teach and talk about some of those skills and some of those things to think about. Okay. And, we will do lots of technical stuff, and I'll show you technical stuff that you wouldn't see in any textbook. Okay. So that's also important. It's not that this isn't important, the technical stuff. Okay. It's critical. Like, this is the core of it, but that's not sufficient. And what I usually see is, sometimes I'll see people who are good at the other stuff, and then they stumble on the technical stuff. Okay. Maybe their background isn't strong enough. Maybe they struggle with the math or something like that. And that can be hard. But more often I see people who are good at the technical stuff. They're really strong there. And then they don't even know about the other stuff until maybe they go to grad school, or they submit a draft of a paper or something. And then the reaction from the reviewers is usually saying like, this isn't even wrong, or like, I have no way how to assess what, I can't even tell what the paper is talking about or claiming. Right. So that's it. So we're going to, level up on our technical skills, but we're also going to pay attention to these things that are not discussed. Okay, that's it. There are no books I can point you to that talk about the other stuff we're going to talk about as well. Just like there are no books that talk about some of the technical things. So we have to do both, because, if we're going to get to GM in research, for research we have to communicate the findings, and we have to be part of a community, and we have to be able to, see what other people are doing and understanding what they're doing and why are they talking about this and why is this topic interesting right now, if it is, and how is that part of the field changing. We need to be able to do all those things. We're not working in a vacuum. Okay. So that's the outsider art, is like someone who's spent 40 years, like secretly, making paintings out of popsicle sticks or something, and then they die. It's like, oh, there are 2 warehouses full of popsicle stick paintings or something that no one knew about. We're not going to do that. We're going to try to figure out, how we can engage in the rest of the community. So that's what I want to get to. And one more analogy with the crack climbing is if you're around those institutions where people are doing the stuff hard, okay, where there are these communities, sort of like the Korean team houses for StarCraft, you'll see that, the analogy would be, the people who are outside the community don't know crack climbing exists, or maybe they've heard of it, whereas the people on the inside, like the people who are up and coming, is like, not only do they know what crack climbing is, it's like, oh yeah, this summer I'm going to go to the summer school and crack climbing again. And I have 3 mentors who are expert crack climbers. One's an Olympic gold medalist. And, would you be willing to mentor me as well. And oh yeah, by the way, both my parents are mountaineers, and so they started me on crack climbing when I was age 3. That's what you'll see. I mean, to be honest, okay, that's what I see, like people with 4 or 5 or 6 mentors and going to summer schools and like that type of thing. And now I'm not saying that to intimidate or scare anyone who wants to, do this stuff at a high level. I'm just saying that exists, okay? And you don't even know it exists if you're outside. Just in the same way that, someone whose parents were, South Korean pro StarCraft players, right? And has been playing StarCraft for a long time. Well, they're probably going to be pretty good at StarCraft, right? They're going to have a head start. But like Richard Feynman said, what one fool can do, so can another. Okay, so these are all learnable things. Like, well, I didn't learn crack climbing until I've been climbing for a while. And yeah, the first couple of weeks I didn't make any progress, but then I got to the point pretty quickly where I love crack climbing. I was doing it all the time. I was crack climbing 4 times a week. So, it just took some effort. Okay. And then, it's the same thing, everything here. It's like, okay, you don't know how to write a technical paper. No one knows how to write a technical paper when you first start. Okay. We'll learn how you do that. It never is like easy because you're communicating really hard ideas, but you can learn things like how to do a literature search, how, like what are certain areas or themes, where would you go? What sort of papers would you look at? How do you cite papers? What, all those sorts of things in the programming languages way, okay? Or in particular, like the scheme and miniKanren way, or the ICFP way, or whatever it is, okay? So these different communities have different standards. And so if you have a PhD in history or a PhD in biochemistry and you're coming to, say functional programming, you'll notice that the traditions are totally different. You'll be like, what journal do I publish in? It's like, well, let me introduce you to the wonderful world of conferences, right? It's just like a totally different thing. And even someone who's a PhD academic who's trying to do work in this area is going to find that like we just do things differently here, okay? And you just have to learn it. You can learn it quickly. None of this is hard in that sense, okay? If you're capable of doing the research, like at this part, if you can do the technical stuff, you can learn the other stuff, but just be aware you have to learn it, okay? And you don't even know some of the things that exist there. You have to learn about that. You have to learn about the community. You have to learn about the venues. You have to learn what they expect for publications. All of those things. You have to read a bunch of papers. You have to learn literature. All that stuff. You're just going to have to learn it, okay? And people don't care if you have a PhD. They really don't. In terms of you writing a paper, you giving a talk, it's not relevant. What does matter is if you can communicate the idea clearly, right? That you can make claims that people understand, that you cite research that's close, and you explain what's different about your research, right? You can explain why it's significant or important what you're doing, all those things. Which parts you think are new, on and on. You can give concrete examples that are concise. Those things are important. Those are really important. Okay, so you could have a PhD, you could be a full professor, and if you can't do those things, people are not going to adopt your ideas in the same way as if you can explain the ideas very clearly. Okay, so that's really important. Yeah. And then, just like one last thing I'll say about this. Yeah, this is kind of the mini game thing, and it fits in this overall theme. PG Bovine had this idea of being a serious contender. Okay, a serious contender, and the idea here. And also, how to interpret things like the numbers you'll hear. Because say you want to become an academic researcher, okay, and programming languages. Like, say you actually want to do that for a living, you want to go to grad school and do it. You will find that for like a starting class of PhD students who have, say, undergrad only, not that many actually become professors in the United States. Okay, there are far fewer tenure track professor positions than there are people who are in the PhD program. Like far fewer, and like for me, Indiana, when I started. This wasn't just in programming languages, but in computer science, there were 30 students who were in my starting class. I think that's right, it's 30. If it's not 30, it's like close to it, okay? Plus or minus 2. But I think there were exactly 30 in my starting PhD class. As far as I can ascertain, 15 of those people finished the PhD. So half of them didn't finish. Now, most of those people finished with a master's, like a research master's. Most of them went on to industry. So it's, I think they've been successful for the most part. They got something out of it. I don't think it's a bad thing that they left, but, for whatever reason, they left. It could have been financial. It could have been, family member got sick. Could have been they got sick. It could be that they didn't enjoy it or they didn't like writing, or who knows. But in any case, it could be just the FANG salary was too much of a draw. Who knows? Maybe they didn't like living in Indiana. I don't know. There are lots of reasons why someone might leave the program. But anyway, so we started with 30. 15 graduated. Half of those 15 people went to Google Mountain View. Okay. And, other people did various things and like postdocs, and I did postdocs, stuff like that. And then at some point, I tried to keep track of people, and as far as I can tell, there was like last time I checked, there was like, I think one other person from my starting class of 30 who was still in academia. Okay. Of the 30 who started. Now there may be more. Okay. Maybe I missed someone or not, but certainly between like not finishing PhD or going to Google Mountain View to industry, like that was already 3/4 of my class between those two things. Okay. And I know some of the people who didn't go to Google Mountain View but finished PhD aren't in academia anymore. So it was like a pretty small number. In fact, I might be the only one of the 30 people still in academia. And so I heard stories like that, Another story I heard was, for an academic, tenure track research position in the United States, there might be 500 applicants for one position. So that's another, number that's pretty scary. And I went through that process. I applied to schools and, I ended up getting a position. At one point, I'm no longer a professor, but I was, a tenure track professor for a while. And I've also been on the other side of that, reviewing applications and watching, like job talks and all that, reading application packages. And so that's pretty intimidating, like 500 to 1, or maybe there are 2 positions or 500 people that apply to 2 positions. But there's another way to think about it as well, which is, okay, so if 500 people apply for an academic position, like what does that really mean? Like, do all of those 500 people, are all 500 people seriously considering that one school for that one position? And are all 500 people in a position where they could do that job? Okay. And you would look at it as like, okay, here's someone who's never published in that area and has like a professional master's and doesn't seem to have any research experience. Like, why did they apply? Or, here's someone who isn't going to graduate for 3 years from their PhD program. Or, here's someone who seems extremely overqualified. Okay, so here's someone applying for like a junior faculty position at, a non-coast university that's not well known. And this person, is like honors and, elite university and have, all sorts of stuff and incredible publication records. Like, are they actually going to go to the school? Like, why would they go there? And there's nothing in the application about them going. And so you'll see that, okay, maybe 500 people applied, but the number of serious contenders, the number of people who actually knew how to write a research statement and took the time and who wrote a cover letter that was personalized to the university and wrote a teaching statement that was coherent, that once you go through all those things and like, will this person even conceivably go to this university? Could this person do the job? Would this person get tenure? Actually out of 500 people, like it probably pretty quickly goes down to 20 people. And then, maybe there's a round of phone interviews, and then it goes, okay, how do people do in the phone interview? Can they, explain what their research is about? And then maybe it goes down to, 5 people, and those 5 people get invited out. And can those 5 people give a talk that's coherent? Can they, stay within their time boundaries? Can they give a talk that excites the faculty members? And when they meet with the faculty members, are the faculty members, do they want to work with this person? Are they excited? Do they think that this person has a chance of getting grants? All of those types of things. Will this person be a good mentor? Will they be a good teacher? Are they capable of teaching classes that need to be taught in the department? So you pretty quickly go from 500 people like down to maybe 5. Now at that point, there's going to be, who gets it out of that 5, who gets an offer is going to be tricky, but the person who gets the offer might go somewhere else. Okay. So really, out of those 5 people, it might really be more like 1 out of 3 chance. Okay. And so of the 500 people who applied, most of those applications are not serious contenders. Like the research statement, doesn't make sense, or, it doesn't seem credible that this person would be able to get a grant when you talk to them on the phone or whatever. They haven't even thought about this, or you ask them basic questions about their research and they're not able to give clear explanations. Okay. How does that research differ from this other, famous line of research that seems closely related, and they've never heard of the other line of research, stuff like that. So, and that's true over and over again. Okay. So you'll hear these numbers that seem scary. Now for the 30 people who started grad school, and 1 or 2 or 3 are still in academia. Well, not everyone started grad school to go into academia. Like I know that one person in my class wanted to do a startup company. That was their plan from the very beginning. A lot of people wanted to be like basically research programmers. Okay. They wanted to work at technology that was going to be deployed at scale that people would use. Okay. So they never intended to go into academia. Okay. Some people left for personal reasons. Some people left because they didn't get along with their advisor, or some people left because, they didn't actually know why they went to grad school other than that they didn't know what they wanted to do. So like, well, I've gone to school for my whole life. I'll just do more school and then I'll decide. And then they decide at some point, well, it's not for me, So there were lots of reasons, and it felt more like medical school, where they say medical school, the hardest part's getting in. Most of the people in my class who left, it wasn't like they were kicked out. In fact, I don't know if anyone was kicked out in my class. I think it was more, they decided at some point that they would rather do something else, right? And so I'm still around because, I enjoy it enough and I'm stubborn enough that, I put up with stuff I I put up with the downs as well as the ups, and I like the flexibility and things like that. So for me, it worked out. Yeah, but that's, that's like another example is I applied for a synthetic biology summer school at Cold Spring Harbor Labs because I was interested in it, and CRISPR was happening. 2015 CRISPR was really hot. My brother's like, yeah, you need to learn about this. This is really cool. It has computational aspects. So I applied, and I spent a lot of time writing my essay or personal statement saying why I wanted to go. And I rewrote that entire statement 5 separate times from scratch, like not editing. I meant throw it away, rethink how I want to talk about what my goals are. Like, why am I someone who does programming languages wanting to go into synthetic biology? And that's a good question. And it's also a very hard question to answer coherently. So, I spent several days, many, many hours, writing, rewriting, assessing, like this isn't quite right. And at the end of the 5th draft, at the end of, 20 hours of writing, I had the 1 page or maybe half a page of writing that I submitted. And I got in, and I found out, I don't know, there were like 20 students or something. I found out later that I was the only person there who was a computer scientist who didn't have like biology experience. Almost everyone was like a biology person. There was like someone who was a math person and another computer science person. I think I was the only one who had never like held a pipette or whatever. And I was also told it was like actually really competitive to get in, but they liked my essay, right? And it's like I was a serious contender. Like I took that very, very seriously. I rewrote it. And so I probably spent, 10 times as long writing it as many of the people who applied. And so I got in, and okay, great. But I was a serious contender. I really brought my A game trying to get into that program. I really wanted it. And then there are other times I haven't been a serious contender. Like when I first started applying for faculty jobs, like I had no idea what I was doing. And my applications and my phone interviews were for the most part not serious contenders, or my job talks yeah, that was not good. Okay. So there's this serious contender theory. And so if you want to write a paper and have that paper, like a research paper, and have it accepted by, say, like one of the SIGPlan conferences, okay, or even from one of the workshops, you want your paper to be a serious contender. You want the paper to be complete. It needs to be submitted on time, right? If you don't submit on time, okay, if it's past the deadline, well, guess what? You were no longer a contender at all, let alone a serious contender. If your paper is full of, claims that are unsupported, you are not a serious contender. If it is not clear from reading the paper what you're even talking about, or what you're proposing, you're not a serious contender. If you're proposing, some grand idea that you claim is going to change computing and programming, and you don't mention any other research that the reviewers think must be related, you're not a serious contender. The paper's just going to be rejected. All the reviewers will say, did you just reinvent this well-known technique? Maybe you didn't. Maybe you came up with something else that's different. But they want to know that you know about that other technique and that you've read about it and you know the literature and you can explain what the difference is. Okay, so it's a serious contender. Same with writing a personal statement for a job application. Same with applying to graduate school. If you're applying to a PhD program in the United States, you need 3 letters of references. Okay, three letters of recommendation or reference letters. And those should be, ideally from people who have worked with you in a research setting, like a mentor, like a professor, or someone running a lab who has seen you work in a research setting and can talk specifically as to what you've done, as opposed to, here's a student in my class and they got, like an A, right? That is not a serious contender level letter. A serious contender level letter is, oh yeah, I supervised a student on this research project and, they did this and this and this, and, a paper came out of it and were, submitted to whatever venue, and the student did this aspect and wrote that and, gave a talk on it and did these experiments and demonstrated knowledge of these and was creative in this way. Like that's a serious contender letter. So I like this idea of serious contender, and, if you don't know what it means to be a serious contender, like I didn't know applying to grad school that I was supposed to have letters of recommendation. I was like, oh, and they should be based on research? That would have been a useful thing to know when I was an undergrad, right? I was like, oh, maybe I want to do some research as an undergrad. So it's sort of working backwards. Or like another thing I wish I had known was, oh yeah, for a PhD program in the United States, usually it's paid in computer science. Like you get paid to go to school, you get a stipend, and the tuition is reimbursed. Okay, not every time, but usually that's the case. And then, in return, you maybe act as a teaching assistant or research assistant. That's something I didn't know. So, there's the things you don't know. And also, okay, so what does it take to be a serious contender? Okay, and what does it look like to have a really good application to a PhD program? What does it look like, to have a really strong letters of recommendation? What does it look like, to have a strong teaching statement? What does it look like to have a strong related work section for the paper you're submitting in that area? All those things. If you don't even know what it should look like or what goes in there, then you're gonna have trouble being a serious contender. Okay, so that's where that number 1 out of 500 comes from. It's like, now it's still competitive. Okay, so maybe the real number is like 1 out of 5 for that opening, or maybe 1 out of 20 even, but it's not really 1 out of 500. So that's not right. And the idea that other numbers I've heard were things like, oh yeah, 0 people are likely to read your dissertation. I heard that. Okay. Most people's dissertation will never be read by anyone, including by their major professor or anyone on their committee. Like other people might skim it, but they're not going to read it. And I'd heard this. I thought it was pretty depressing, but I decided I was really going to concentrate on the writing of my dissertation. I tried to write as well as I could. I kept polishing it and all that. And it turned out people did read that. In fact, a lot of people read my dissertation because it was a serious contender. I put in an enormous amount of work trying to make the writing accessible to a wide audience as possible. And in fact, people were like, sending me photos of their bound copy of my dissertation, or, I would go to a conference and someone would have a printout of it and they'd want me to sign it or something. So that was me being, I was like in try hard mode. I was like, okay, I'm going to make this dissertation as good as I can, as opposed to, well, forget it. I graduate now. It's time to just write more papers. So that's it. And I've done it both ways. I've done plenty of things where I was not a serious contender and I did not bring my A game. Like I said, I've been rejected from my own workshop that I started. I shouldn't say it's my own workshop, but it's a workshop that I co-founded on miniKanren. I've had my own papers like rejected, and like not rejected gently either, like full on rejection. And those papers deserved it because they were not serious contenders. They were not complete drafts that were, easy to read, and they were a mess, and I was making claims that were not supported, and I ran out of time. Okay. And so in hindsight, I just should have either started earlier or probably just not submitted. But they certainly were not serious contender efforts. But whenever I've submitted something that was like a serious contender level, right, where it's like, okay, I've written 5 drafts of it, or whatever it is, and I know what it should look like, something that's quality. Okay. Doesn't mean I'm copying the exact format. This is my own thing, but I'm going to do something that I'm proud of. Okay. So whether or not I get it or not, this is like a real effort that is not, it's not a rejected from my, my own workshop effort. By the way, I know other people who've been in this position. It kind of just happens, but like, I don't want to do that, right? I don't want to be at the level of, like it should have been rejected from the workshop I co-founded for the programming language I co-designed and then described in the book I co-wrote, right? That was not serious contender level. So, you hear these numbers, or like another number I heard was most PhD graduates, most people who get a PhD end up writing 0 papers after they graduate. Okay. Or like publishing 0 papers, or like either 0 or 1. Like they just don't, they don't do anything. They get the PhD and then they're done with the writing of papers. I don't know if that's true, but that's a number I heard when I was in grad school and hearing all these, scary numbers and depressing numbers. Like, well, I don't know if that's true or not. Like I said, a whole bunch of my classmates went to industry and seemed to be very happy and very productive doing that. Okay. So there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe they weren't interested in writing those papers. Or maybe some people never figured out what it takes to be a serious contender when writing a paper. I don't know. Maybe, there are a lot of people who just like the technical stuff and they don't like writing. So maybe that's why they didn't write a paper. Could be lots of reasons, but just because let's say that statistic is true, that most people don't write any papers after they graduate, that's got no bearing on what you do. And you don't need a PhD. You don't even need an undergraduate degree to write papers. Okay. And to write good papers. What you need to do is be a serious contender and know what that entails. You need to know what it means to write a quality paper, and you need to know what it's like to write a quality related work section. Need to know what it's like to present your idea clearly and to avoid making a bunch of, extraneous claims that you can't support. You need to know what the difference is between a claim you support with evidence and a claim you don't support with evidence. You need to understand all that stuff to be a serious contender. Okay. You need to edit your paper and revise your paper. You need to, if you want to be a serious contender, you show the paper to other people, colleagues or whatever you have, or friendly people who are good at reading and will give you honest feedback, who are knowledgeable. Okay. And that, developing a network of such people is part of the whole process, right? Like that's part of this is having your own network and people you can communicate with who are capable of doing things like reading a draft and giving you honest feedback. And you need to know that you shouldn't give them the draft, an hour before the deadline at 3 a.m. Okay. So those are all things that's important. And, the idea is, by the end of this series, by the end, I shouldn't say the end, I hope this will continue on for a long time, but we want to work towards the ability to be a serious contender, to understand what that means in different contexts, to look at things like, let's look at some papers that are really strong. And what's done in those papers are what are strong application materials for, a grant or for a PhD program or for a faculty position, right? Like we can look at things like that. What does it mean to be a serious contender? But part of it is just like knowing that things exist. If you don't know that something exists, it's going to be hard to be a serious contender. Okay. Or that, if you don't know what a good paper looks like, in programming languages, if you don't know, if you don't read papers, well, how in the world are you going to do research and communicate that if you don't watch talks and you don't read papers. Okay. You should be reading dissertations. Okay. All those sorts of things. So that's why we have these practices that we're starting now. Okay. So that's part of, like your laddering is starting these practices that the GMs do, right? GMs are reading papers. They will read dissertations. They write. They assess arguments and evidence. Those sorts of things. Those are things that we care about. It's not just writing code. Okay, writing code's fun, and we'll talk about analyzing programming languages and all that stuff. But ultimately, we want to be able to communicate our ideas, write a talk, record a video, whatever it is. That's really important. Okay, so that's critical. All right. So next time, I kept this one shorter than the last one. Next time I do want to get into the scheme versus Java, but I'm hoping that what I'm trying to do, why I'm not just diving into like scheme, let's say, the technical aspects, I'm hoping that will be clear. Okay, it's not if we want to do research and think like a researcher and do things like write papers that are not considered outsider art but are considered serious contenders in whatever venues we're submitting to. We're gonna have to learn a whole lot more than just the technical aspect, and even for the technical aspect, we're gonna have to learn things that are not written in any book. Okay, and the same here with these practices. There are a whole bunch of things that are not written in books. Like no one tells you how to do all those other things. That's usually mentoring and lots of practice and modeling existing behavior, existing artifacts, and, building up a group of trusted people, all those sorts of things, and experience, and, submitting things that are not serious contenders, and learning the difference between the two, and not giving up, not rage quitting. Okay. More GG, more skill. That's a lot of it is just perseverance. It's like, well, the first few papers you write might be kind of rough. That's fine. Just keep at it and you'll learn it. It's a learnable skill, just like programming. Okay. That's it. Talk to you tomorrow. Hopefully tomorrow. Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.